Okay, I'm Michael Pashkin. We have people here, we have people on Zoom. I'll do a little intro here. Thomas DeFrantz directs SLIPPAGE, Performance Culture Technology, in residence at Northwestern and Segal Design Institute. DeFrantz received the 2017 Outstanding Research in Dance Award from the Dance Studies Association and contributed concept and voiceover for a permanent installation on Black social dance at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. DeFrantz has taught at the American Dance Festival, Impulse Dance, Ponderosa, and the New Waves Dance Institute, as well as at MIT, Stanford, Yale, NYU, Hampshire College, Duke, and the University of the Arts, and the University of Nice. DeFrantz believes in our shared capacity to do better and to engage our creative spirit for a collective good that is anti-racist, pro-feminist, and queer-affirming.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks to my friends here in the Segal Design Center, and welcome to everyone who's able to be here for this presentation. Especially happy to see Dean Johnson from the School of Communications. We're always glad to see you as we make space to share ideas and share ways to think together. Dancing the interface involves creating physical movement in relationship to data stored and manipulated by electric charges. Dance improvisers and designers who work in this area of technology constantly face challenges of non-human interaction and the risk of mechanical failure. We never really know if it's going to work or not. Will the connection work? Will the machine blow up? How's this going to sort of move forward? In addition, improvisers working with computer interfaces endure overwhelming senses of non-empathetic indifference to questions of social identity that provide the warp and the woof of physical imagination. This talk offers commentary and analyses of these processes as they were realized in the SLIPPAGE lab, Performance Culture Technology, which was in residence at MIT from 2003 to 2012, and then at Duke University from 12 until earlier this year, and now happily is affiliated with the Segal Design Center. Aw, I was going to do that. You got it. I promise. All right, we'll turn it down now. Thank you. The case studies under consideration here include dancing improvised house music choreography while fitted with a wireless Meditron system, that fed data that could control pitch, tempo, and playback for pre-selected audio files, creating motion capture files of house dancing for use in a stage performance, improvising tap dancing on responsive floors that issued sound and video depending on the performer's improvised step, and improvising with Wii controllers like this one that repurposed photographic images onto specially constructed surfaces in real-time performance. In each of these encounters, the terms of physical comprehension expanded and contracted, suggesting an everywhereness and a not really here-ness that deserve exploration. Exploring methods of improvising toward empathy, this talk, I want to suggest ways in which dancing bodies redistribute energy in relation to impossible connectivities that are often not human and insistently non-empathic. So I want to speak for just a moment about the Slippage Lab. This is a photo of the Slippage Lab setup in our first space when we were at, I'm not sure where this is, but one of the spaces we were in before we're here at Northwestern now. And here you're looking at a 2-channel sort of green screen setup we worked on for a performance project. The green screen over here, and then the image, the dancer, in this case, I was testing it out for a performance, is implicated into imagery that's offered up in a different location. Here is that same setup in a performance. Oh, it looks like. Oh, yeah, the students had, at Duke University, the students had taken over the president's house to demand some attention to a racialized interaction that had happened. And so this project, you should have told me, was to involve students, but the students were all busy in the takeover. So I was performing alongside a graduate student in the setup at that point. We started this class here at Northwestern this spring quarter this year, so I want to share some information about that. Here we go.
The theme for this quarter is butterfly effect, so we're kind of working off of that and like how small changes might propagate into like a big change.
We're working with projection to make like wind and hurricane and how something super tiny can morph into something super huge.
Work kind of reveals itself in these unusual arrangements of camera, projection, and ways that audience is not allowed to see what's happening except through media. Let's take a look.
You, me, goodbye, alone.
Okay, and that's just a little trailer. And there are the students' names who are involved in the course in our first offering of it here at Northwestern alongside Segal. You saw that Nick, who works downstairs, came along for the ride to work with the students in terms of Arduino building, and we had a terrific time. One thing, and I appreciate this from the introduction to the talk today, the Slippage Lab has an ethical system and a value system we move towards, where we are anti-racist intentionally, we are proto-feminist, and we are queer-affirming. So as the students enter this question of performance and technology and design in relationship to interface, we start there. Like, we're going to begin with this value system and try to move towards it. It doesn't mean we get there every time or every day. It doesn't mean we know how to do that, but it means that we're actually aware of the possibility or the potential to move in these directions, even as we're designing, working as engineers or performers. And that's just super important to the lab itself as well. So we follow this sort of value system and this kind of ethical mapping as we're imagining what our interfaces will do and what they're for. So, to paraphrase Isadora Duncan, as a performer, I often work as a soloist, but seldom do I dance alone. For me, the ghosts of sensation and the traces of light that surround being in time animate my approach to gesture, space, energy, emotion, and presence. I move by impulse, as I tried to demonstrate before, an impulse shaped by desire and ambition to fulfill or extend a sense of capacity. We still do not know what a body can do. And improvising as a dancer, I ask this question again and again. These are abstract motivations in a way, but they also allow me to imagine a sexualized, sensual, gender-becoming person at once inside and outside of motion. I work most consistently as a gestural improviser within particular narrative circumstances, responding in real time to motivations provided by electronic interface designed by collaborating artists of SLIPPAGE. For me, moving with purposeful presence in modes of immediate discovery generates a sense of honesty about dancing that feeds my ethical sense of performing. If performing might be about sharing and expanding capacity for discovery among gathered witnesses, including the performers themselves, I've worked to develop strategies for mobilizing energy and gestural impulse in these performances. Thinking physically and striving to respond immediately, I work to combine lingering questions about race, class, gender, and sexuality with the choices of the moment. Our creative shift into improvisation as a method, so when Slippage started, we really weren't always working with improvisation, even as we were always doing interface design. But our group now works with improvisation as its foundational ethos. Our creative shift into improvisation as a method arrived alongside my work in interface design. Slippage collaborations feature digital archives manipulated in response to the physical gestures of the performer. So that's what we witnessed before. There's an archive of sound. They're programmed through a couple different sort of setups through the Wiimote, and then the gestures of the performer produce the sounds in a certain kind of way. As we mobilize these interface designs toward interface with movement choices conceived to be dialogic, an ethic of responsibility to engage the interfaces at hand inspired me to work in immediate responsiveness to the present condition, even as that condition changed and the interfaces provided unexpected information for the emergent performance. As I often narrate for students of performance and technology, finding an abiding method to be present in the moment encourages physical, social, and intellectual flexibility that might be important for many of us in various circumstances of life. Ultimately, this is my quest as an improviser, to engage and model social flexibility as a mode of art making. Slippage artists often consult theoretical writings as well to better understand ideologies that circulate in our performance projects. Engaging with theory is an embodied practice. I want to say that one again, my performance studies friends. Engaging in theory is an embodied practice, and in time, these writings become foundational concepts for the development of research into performance. In addition to helping us understand how social relations have been made manifest, concepts of psychoanalysis, cultural memory, physical empathy, or social subjection offer points of entry to the organization of energy in time and space. We take it for granted that the continual interplay between theoretical writing and work in the studio enlivens dance, as well as the process of designing performance interfaces. Okay, so let me spend the rest of our time together talking about how that operates. So let's start with the afterlives of slavery. Performance theorist Christina Sharp pivots us toward the new Black dance studies, if you will, in the wake, on Blackness and being. So in this text that Christina Sharp has written that responds to a whole slate of writing that we might call Afro-pessimist, we're wondering at the afterlives of slavery as a container for understanding bodies in motion as bodies in surveillance and fugitivity. This is research that conceives itself entirely implicated in the formation of Black life. To the wants, sorry, I need to move this screen here. Black life that wants to demand a unified Black subject. So we're resisting this idea of a unified Black subject. That is, a Black subject that will remain one thing at a time, somehow straight. So in thinking of the afterlives of slavery, we might dance to demonstrate our protest to the assumption of a unified subject. Working with performance curator of the MCA here in Chicago, Tara Aisha Willis, Tara and I wrote the following about this idea. We wrote that black moves that emerge under the umbrella paradigm of an African diaspora become dance that resists category and restores faith. We call this black dance to underscore its commonalities and its diversity. It's common in terms of the everyday ubiquity of many forms of physical expression among black people and in circumstances rendered black by social circumstance and experience. Diverse in the range of activity that extends multidirectionally towards museums, church sanctuaries, street festivals, basketball courts, college classrooms, dance studios, and literary archives. We claim black moves as we claim black lives, urgent, meaning-filled, seemingly impossible, conflicted and sanctified, queer, immigrant, and embodied processes of engaged intellect. So I want to move into a project that we made in response to this questioning around the afterlives of slavery. And we had a commission from a museum to respond to some work by the visual artist Kara Walker. So again, a little more foundational theoretical modeling here. The New Black Dance Studies confirms the vibrant presence of emerging research paradigms, methods and approaches that speak to 21st century manifestations of kinetic black knowledge. We dance, we believe in dance, and we wonder at its effects and affects. We seek to open space for unusual and particular studies of how black dance is foundational and nurturing to black corporealities and black life. So in this project, we were invited to respond to the visual artist Kara Walker's, the series that she made regarding the Civil War. So she was responding to Harper's pictorial history of the Civil War. And I think she made 12 plates that several museums around the country have now acquired. So we were invited to create a performance that somehow responded to what Walker had done. Oops, sorry. And what was interesting in this project for me, I actually wrote this interface. So we were trying to create a kind of negative shadow. So Walker works with the idea of black people at the center of thinking about the Civil War. One of the interesting things about the Harper pictorial history of the Civil War is that while the war certainly was about the capacity to maintain slavery, there are very few representations of black people in this document, like across its entire publication history. So Walker was working to somehow embed black figures into these visual narratives and rethink them. So we created this. Here we see a little bit of the echo of how this was operating, but it was an interface that captured the movement of the performers and then redistributed them as a kind of negative shadow or reverse shadow. So in this case, a white shadow against the screen and surrounding the performers' bodies. And here in the background, if you're not familiar with Kara Walker's work, you can see a larger representation of one of her plates from this series. And I think we have a little bit of a clip to see it in motion here. Let's see. Yeah. Oops, sorry. That was me. Let's try again. At these objects in this room and the breath that's missing from the silhouette. We wonder what happens when the silhouette, when the black figure has breath, when the body is allowed to explode the possibility of its flattening, when the body has energy and life, when the body is enlivened and has vitality. We wonder what happens when gestures recur, when we rethink narratives of the past. The war, not brother against brother, but the war to maintain slavery, to maintain the disavowal of black subjects, the impossibility of black subjects, the no place for black people, to put black people at the center of U.S. history, to put black people at the center of a show, to put black people at the center, to put black at the the center of these images. Okay, so it just gives you the tiniest taste of what this project was about. As I was listening, I was trying to remember what the sound was. It was a particular piece of music that was playing in reverse. I remember when we figured out that that's how we wanted to underscore the gestures on stage in this performance. But then we had to figure out how to actually do that. So some discovery happens as we're designing these interfaces and working on the projects, moving them forward. Okay. Oh, there we go. Yep. See if I can let it play. All right, I guess I need to do one thing at a time, so we'll move on. So I want to think now with a very good friend of ours, Hershini Bana Young, and the idea of hauntings of violence. Hershini Young writes, performance can never be entirely new or entirely volitional, as all performance repeats prior non-original substitutions, even if those substitutions are invisible, forgotten, buried, or ignored. Professor Young is a professor at UT Austin, and she's a performance theorist who writes about economics as well. She also writes, to be black is to have accrued a subjectivity haunted by the spectral traces of a social, political, and ideological history. In her provocative study of an African diaspora that is always already bound up with gender, performance theorist Hershini Young wonders at the historical injury and collective wounding wrought by slavery and colonialism. She works to delineate a diaspora that is much more than global patterns of flows and resistances, or even systems of cultural exchange. She wants to consider one that might be embedded in the dense structures of memory. This memory includes the hauntings of violence done not only to individuals, but also to groups of subjugated Black people who have been cast as the ghosts of modernity, the indispensable coerced mechanisms of labor, the other against whom the whiteness of the imperial subject was formed. So turning to a slippage project, sometime in 2005, it became clear that we wanted to think about how environments hold history and how particular locations tell their own tales of human trauma and survival. This might be one of the reasons we engage what do we call it, when we're trying to remember the people who've been here before. Thank you, at the beginning of the event. I just lost the words.
Well, that.
No, who are the people who've lived here? Our
Ancestors?
yes, the custodians of the ground, though. We call this, what do we call this at the beginning of an event?
Land acknowledgement?
Yes, thank you, the land acknowledgement. So thank you so much. As we're thinking of the land acknowledgement, Slippage was curious about remembering other kinds of things that had happened in the spaces where we were working at the time. So Bonnie Young's 2006 text, Haunting Capital, Memory Text and the Black Diasporic Body, offered us a framework for thinking about the complex ways in which trauma and violence circulate across geographies. So poet Jean Toomer's experimental text, Cain, from 1923, inspired our exploration of the lives of women and men circumscribed by violence as African Americans living in the South during the height of sharecropping. In Cain, the various exchanges among people are always witnessed by an uncompromising natural surround. So we started working on this text, and as we were playing with the text, we realized that the sugarcane fields featured prominently in the text. So we wanted to develop a responsive cane field environment to act as a mirror and witness to the movement of a man and a woman throughout the space. Constructed of tubing that usually surrounds fluorescent lights. So we figured out how to take the tubing out of the fluorescent light out of the tubing and use the tubing as a way to capture image. And then we included microphones and speakers, miniature cameras that were released onto the tubing structures by short throw projectors. We worked to create a cane field that breathed, animated by sound and light according to random algorithms at all times, and specific setups at some times during performance. According to what the microphones in the cane field heard, they would release sound into a soundscape at irregular intervals. The sounds included musical cues pulled from a score by composer Tara Rogers, and clips culled from the Library of Congress recordings of slave narratives from the Federal Writers Project. 2 responsive strands of synthetic cane allowed for movement alongside, in front of, and behind their vertical rods. So they were always vertical, and then you could move around them. Image distributed on the strands ranged from archival materials of African American sharecropping to newly created film imagery of the performers. One area of the performance space represented a small cabin, and that space didn't have a mediated sort of interface, so we were trying to think in our first discoveries, what if there was an area where there wasn't media and the memory operated differently, and then there was this electronic cane field. And I put in a couple slides so you could see our process. So here's our very first discovery sort of working through, and then the second version where we actually have the tubing that I was narrating. So in the first iteration, when we had just a couple weeks of discovery, we just put computer monitors there. We knew that this is what we were headed towards, but we didn't know how we were going to get there. So this is an engineering and design problem that we had to solve. We kind of knew where we wanted to go, and we weren't sure how to get there. So here you see just these sort of bamboo stalks suggesting something around some computer monitors. And then about a year later, we had sort of figured out how to make these tubing devices into a kind of scenic surround for the project to emerge. This project also used a Wiimote, so similar to an interface that was really similar to the one I demonstrated at the beginning. In this case, you can barely see it because of the darkness of the image, but it's hidden within a bamboo stalk so that when the performer was moving, the image of the little girl would actually be animated so that she could watch the performance while it was unfolding in front of her. It was kind of the idea. The patch written for this particular setup was an osculator, which is a program that's readily available online, even still, and it allows for data from the sensors that operate within the controller to be processed by Isadora. So we're using the Isadora software, which is a software that we work with in the performance technology class. It's the first thing we do in that course that we'll be teaching again in the spring. We created a setup that allowed the motion of the controller to influence the scale of the portrait image displayed on one of the cane fields, and that's what you're looking at here. The portrait displayed in any performance of the work was chosen by the program at random from an archive of several available images. So when this sequence started, the performer wouldn't know which person was going to be watching the dance that unfolded here. Waving the controller like a magic wand changed the size of the image along horizontal, vertical, or both axes in tandem. Dancing with the controller in hand, the performer could manipulate the size and shape of a child's face that seemed to gaze impassively at the dance performance underway. Created to suggest possibilities of a shimmering, mediated history mixed in real time via a specially constructive responsive environment, Kane wanders through an interface that responds to the dancers, offering sound in response to sound, image in response to motion, and adjustments of sound or image in response to what the interface perceived. Dancing the interface, and especially in the setup that involved the Wii controller and the oversized portrait, well, this forced my attention to the point of contact, my hand holding the device. Disguised as a discarded cane stalk in a wooden reed-like enclosure, the controller demanded my creative attention and motion. The interface between its movements and the image on the cane field correlated to my own visual attention to the image. My movements became inordinately driven by my hands, the amount of force needed to affect width, the shifts in velocity or angle that adjusted simultaneous X and Y calibration. So as any video game fan knows, the Wii controller offers a robust platform with reliable data streams that are not difficult to learn to manipulate. But dancing with the disguised controller raised other performance concerns. Turning toward the ground, I work to maintain vertical horizon of the controller so as to only adjust the projected face slightly during this maneuver. Tilting my torso while raising my arms, I stayed attentive to the angle of my hand holding the controller so that the overall size of the projective image would shrink and expand in time with my movement. In total, these attentions to the limb and hand most responsible for the control of the interface strongly adjusted my movement choices toward a delicacy and minutia not present in other portions of the performance. So here I'm just trying to point out how the interface has its own desire and needs, and then we have to figure out how to respond to the interface in a way that moves us all towards the storytelling we're after. Dancing improvisationally in the electronic cane field, inspired by the potent poetry and storytelling of Jean Toomer, embodying imagined women's lives probably too real by half to be drawn as fiction, I felt a traumatic return to rage and confusion. My usual cool modes of movement that typically aligned well with technology still in development with various slippage projects, well, it failed in this circumstance. My movements felt awkward and incomplete, flimsy, mechanical. My movement couldn't respond to the emotion released by visiting the scene of subjection, even though we created scenes of our own volition. Hershina Bani Young asserts that, quote, performance always carries the ghostly traces of a history that is always violent. So for me, Kane confirmed this trace even in its first workshop iterations. So this is the very first workshop where you can see the sort of house that had no media, and then the cane field in development. And I think when we finally moved to performance, and this piece stayed in production for about 5 years, another group of artists performed it. So I tend to work on these interfaces while we're developing them, but then other people perform inside of them. So here we see Amber Henry doing a movement inside the same moment in the performance, which got transformed. And let's take a look at the first 3 or 4 minutes of the show when we finally figured it out. These sound cues are happening at random by the algorithm that organized the space. And there's a kind of jazzy sound that shows up sometimes. I think that was on a sensor that's listening for footsteps. As is often with interfaces like this, we had to spend a lot of time scraping data so that sounds didn't overlap, because then we couldn't recognize what we were listening to. So we had to build a lot of envelopes that require a pause or a waiting. movement material is responding directly to bits of either short stories or poems from Kane. So if you're a literature person and you know Kane, you can recognize which story this is, which sequence this is, hopefully. I think here you'll see some live feed and pre-recorded video, both. See how the angle is. But the one character performer gets pregnant in the cornfield, and then she has to have her baby in the cornfield. I think we went to an overhead camera here. There you can see it in the background, quite a hint. I don't know if we're going to see the cane field anymore in this clip. Okay. So I'm thinking about this cane field that's, watching, witnessing everything, remembering things, redistributing them according to its algorithmic design, but also stays impassively present. Like the cane, we keep going back to these images of this cane sort of gently waving in the wind, no matter what happened between the four performers in the performance. Okay. So I want to talk about one more piece, and then we'll be there for today, empathy. So I'm thinking alongside Susan Foster, who is a professor of dance studies at UCLA, and she's written several books thinking about empathy, and one that's called Choreography and Empathy. And she writes that to choreograph empathy entails the construction and cultivation of a specific physicality whose kinesthetic experience guides our perception of and connection to what another is feeling. She wonders, are there techniques of knowledge production that invite us to imagine the other without presuming knowledge of the other? So dance theorist Susan Foster offers a historicizing methodology to examine how bodies feel and how they feel about each other. This is really what she said she wanted to explore in choreographic empathy. In seeking out correspondence between choreography, kinesthesia, and empathy, Foster explores how changes in these concepts over time have contributed to changes in a general capacity for understanding what movement does and how it can feel to movers and their witnesses. Foster encourages her readers to note how choreography can provide clues to the specific experience of the physical in the ways that it records or documents movement, and also in the ways that it sets forth principles upon which movement is to be learned and crafted. Empathy, as a concept of great interest for contemporary neuroscientists, offers a most fundamental capacity of our minds, foundational to the very way that knowledge is acquired. So in some ways, studies of empathy in neuroscience, and I want to say in dance studies, we're trying to understand how we care for each other. And Foster suggests that one way we learn is by leaning in instead of stepping away, which might be a usual sort of response to new information. So empathy might be, another way to think of it might be the lean in. How do you lean in towards ideas that are new or unusual? The important distinction between movers and those watching becomes manifest in wearable technology that correlates to gesture to effect without visible means of connection. Many artists have engaged wireless or camera tracking technologies to distribute image or sound according to the movement of the dancers on stage. And yet, watching a wearable technology work is quite different from performing in one. Somehow we still might imagine that these technology-driven works can generate some sort of empathy for viewers. Working on the house music project from 2002 to 2007, I enjoyed dancing in a custom-designed interface that predicted the Xbox Connect interface. So we didn't have Xbox Connect yet, so this is before that. We were working with a MIDI-tron. And the MIDI-tron setup allowed my movement to influence audio cues. Wearing the interface, which was a series of sensors connected to a wireless MIDI-tron pack, I imagined sharing the sense of flow and movement impulse with gathered witnesses who could sense the connection between movement and sound. With the house music project, Slippage wanted to explore a history of house music, a widely distributed but little discussed idiom of Black popular culture. I think we know more about it now than we knew about it 15 years ago. House is a Black American musical form of the late 1970s, born of its predecessors, disco and funk, and contemporaneous to the emergence of hip hop. House gave way to techno and rave events before splitting into the myriad forms practiced today. So today we have jungle house, trip house, hard house, acid house, chill house, and on and on and on. House began in queer, LGBTQ, Black and Latino, Latinx spaces of celebration as music that was kinetically connecting Sunday morning gospel music and worship traditions with Saturday night imperatives of partying. In house settings, a DJ mixes snatches of pre-recorded gospel-style vocals over pulsing, regularly meted drum and bass foundations. Many house DJs add live musical accompaniment to their mixing, typically with a small keyboard synthesizer connected to a dual turntable setup. House is an electronic form of Black popular music built around the circulation of electricity for its production. So I'm still trying to think about how signal surrounds us. And I say this to students in our performance technology class. You know, maybe 10 years ago, it was still possible to get outside of signal, to go somewhere where there was no signal around you. It's pretty much impossible to do that now, because we're also super committed to our phones and devices. So the idea that you would spend a day or two not in relationship to electricity, that's super rare these days. Okay, so Slippage artists originally imagined the work as a performance installation, and it developed from a large and ever-expanding archive of historical materials related to house music. We wanted to create an interface that would allow the performer to operate as a DJ, as dance movements would trigger events in various media directed at a physical environment setting that represented a literal house. Over a few years of casual research and imagination sessions, the project moved toward realization in a month-long residency at the University of Texas at Dallas in January of 2006. And at UTD, at that time they had it was actually the most sophisticated motion capture lab in the US, briefly. At UTD, we were able to make use of the large, fully functional motion capture lab to generate data streams based on house music movements and house dance movements, and to play with the wireless MIDI-tron setup in a theatrical space. So for this setup, we were working with Max MSP. We were chatting about that before with someone. We don't work with Max much anymore, but at that time we were. We placed a variety of small sensors at different points of the body. Accelerometers were on the shoulders, tilt sensors were on the ankles, and there was a button sensor in the right hand. These sensors fed information to a Max setup that determined the various events related to sound. Sound sequences could be accelerated, slowed to a zero tempo, or played in reverse. So the dancer could reverse the loop while they were moving inside the outfit. Sound could be equalized according to gesture, with a raised hand triggering an EQ that sounded only high tones, while a foot stamp triggered an EQ that emphasized low bass tones. So dancing, you could create the sounds in a way. hopefully that were similar to house music. Particular shimmies of the shoulders could trigger the looping of particular sound fragments combined with other motions. Fragments could be layered on top of each other by the performer. The project also involved motion capture, as I'd mentioned before. Dancing this interface, I always wondered when the connection would work and when it would fail. The wireless MIDI-tron infrastructure was not nearly so robust or reliable as we might have thought. While the interface worked much more often than it didn't, and probably produced the hoped-for outcome in nearly every performance application, I never felt sure that it would. And so my performances with the body pack attached were never so free-flowing or fully engaged as I might have liked. In sequences that involved actively controlling sound via gesture, I rarely felt free to move and assume that my dancing partner, the MIDI-tron, would keep up with my movements. So I'll show you just a couple clips here. This is an early iteration where the house is really just some pieces of wood with some fabric. And I guess we have here, so here's motion capture. If you haven't seen this, the old-fashioned motion capture where you put the balls on the body. So each one of those points is a ball on the body, and we're in this huge sort of warehouse at UT Dallas, and just moving through a kind of flapping gesture. Then you have the data, and it needs to be rendered. So we could render it onto, well, you had to use some sort of stock image to render it onto, or someone had to create. So in this case, we took this little boy figure. So that's still me moving, the data's been captured, and then just attached to this figure. And here I think we're gonna see the MIDI-tron in performance, just the demo of the gestures. It's not a great rendering. Okay. You get the tiniest sense of it there. And again, the MIDI-tron, I wore it under a costume so we could test it that way. Here and here, I don't really remember. Here, down by the ankles, but I do remember the button, because the button was like the only reliable piece of the interface. It's like, well, if I hit the button, then we're gonna actually have that one kind of sound, probably. But otherwise, it was a little finicky and a little hard to sort of understand what it was up to. So just a couple more ideas to wrap up. The short amount of time available to actually work with the interface affected the way that the performance could be realized. While we developed the context for the project across several years, the actual implementation phase of the project was quite tiny, only 3 months. This accelerated timeline was not conducive to an in-depth experimentation or achievement. As with many technology-driven projects, the diminished amount of tech time profoundly influenced what happened on stage. We do plan to return to this project sometime in the future, and we probably won't be working with a wearable pack, but we'll be working with camera-based interface, which is a little more like what's happening now, and in some ways a little more reliable. Okay. So with these three, it's a couple more paragraphs to share with you. A truism suggests that technological intervention will not surpass or equal the variety of stimulation that personal interplay provides. In many ways, these three examples confirm this assumption. Improvising in these environments, I wonder how I feel. This wondering is an active component of my performance research. It is the process of assessment that allows me to make improvisational movement choices as I dance, and it feeds design choices that we make as we develop technologies for dance interface. These examples offer a range of responses to dancing and interface. While these three slippage projects employ technologies as means to an end, we developed their interfaces to answer particular questions of historiography in terms of dance theater. As an interdisciplinary research group steeped in the American Educational Academy, Slippage sources contemporary theory, historical research, popular culture, African American folklore, gender and sexuality studies, dance, theater, and performance studies to imagine alternative histories for underexplored topics. As I hope these ideas in this talk demonstrate, these academic modes of analysis inspire theatrical projects that tilt toward the creation of danceable interfaces, designed carefully to explore the topics, preferably projects that realize themselves with improvisatory modes of moving at their core. Narrated in this way, the ambition to explore alternative histories through dance takes precedence over the development of the interface. So the ambition to explore the history or storytell takes precedence over the development of the interface. This only seems fair to me. For me, this alignment of technological research that aids in the development of theatrical storytelling predicts a potential for development that centers an ambition to communicate. While these interfaces sometimes felt chilly and left me craving palpable human connection, they arrived in response to a need for physical augmentation precipitated by the project at hand. They allow a connection across distances otherwise impossible. Perhaps they predict an alternative sort of empathy, a different way of feeling across space-time that, as we work more and more in VR, we will come to develop and understand. Improvising dance in these interfaces, and according to our agreed-on narrative constraints, I often thought of the engineers, the technologists, the researchers, and the collaborating designers as I attempted to manipulate a tone wearing the Miditron, or stretch the face of a young woman with the Wii controller. By themselves, these interfaces seldom allowed for the spark of empathetic recognition as another improvising performer might have done. In the end, these human relationships and all the missteps and accomplishments that led us toward performance were the material that fed my ability to compose while dancing. And I'm going to stop right there. Thank you so much for your attention. I think we have just a few minutes for maybe 2 questions. Let's see if we can do it. Thank you.
Sound on from the Zoom people?
Let's see if we can do 2. I'd love it.
So I think Zoom people can ask questions out loud.
Sure, they can ask out loud too. Oh, little echo.
Turn off your speaker.
Thank you so much, yeah.
I was really interested in your discussion of the reliability of the technology and how that affected the performance. I was curious if you ever find inspiration in the sort of unreliability of the technology or when it fails.
Thank you so much. That's such a great question, and I'm really glad that we're on the faculty together now. So, I think this move towards improvisation was in large part a response to essentially the unreliability of the kind of interfaces we're designing and working on. Because we only develop them, we work on a project for maybe 5 years and show it for about 5 years when we figure it out, but we're not making necessarily projects for the marketplace. So, that would be a kind of next step to really build in the robustness. So then for us, the idea is, well, can we get it to a place where it usually works and then see what it can do in a performance circumstance? The biggest challenge is always light when we're working with camera-based interfaces, because theatrical light or room light and different RGB, whatever the sensing mechanism or the interface is going to be, depends an awful lot on how the light is controlled or mediated in terms of making the interface reliable. But yeah, this move from sort of pre-choreographed or pre-agreed upon movements to improvisational strategies is really bound up in working in interface design and then having to make sense of things that don't always work the way that we think they will. So thanks for that question. It's a great place for experimentation to keep growing and then design to keep revealing itself. All right, can we do one more? Let's hear it. Thank you so much. Sure.
I was curious about the points in the lecture where you spoke of memory and especially in the Afro-diasporic experience, the faith that you have in the technology, in yourselves as performers, and carrying that forth in what's manifested. And what that brought up for me, especially when you were talking about house, is spirituality. Throughout the entire conversation you were having with us just now, I just kept hearing, what about the spirit? And how is that speaking to the work that you're doing? I just wanted to offer that and invite your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. It's such a great comment and question, and it's definitely the hauntingness of this. So what if we, there's a lot of what if in the work that I'm up to or at Slippage Lab. What if we were an engineering lab or a design lab that has a moral compass and, sort of a value system? Because that's unusual, to say, well, we're a lab, where are we working? We work in anti-racist, proto-feminist, queer-affirming manner. What if we were thinking of the people who help design the interfaces as we're performing? So spirituality, bringing the ancestors in, so the land acknowledgement, where I got a little stumbled today, like bringing the people towards us, and again, this idea of leaning in, I would let all of those things be around an idea of spirit or care or movement towards, and I wonder about moving in those ways in design as engineering students, in Mech E, electrical E, because often we often think that it's super, well, you're just trying to solve the problem. But I guess what I'm really after here is we're still people. Like, we're people inside solving the problem. And the peopleness can be a thing that helps us reimagine something or shift something in a way we might not have thought of so that something else could happen. And I think ultimately that's why we gather at Segal or in other sort of formations, because we wonder what else there could be and we want to chase it down. So let's keep going. And if spirit is a way to move towards it, or spirituality, then let's let that be one of the avenues or vectors that helps us design something that helps something else happen that we certainly all need. So thanks for that. It wasn't a great answer, but it's a terrific question that helps kind of me reflect on what we're trying to do. The Slippage Lab will have actual space in the Lewis building, so that's another part of campus. But I will be teaching the performance technology class, and I hope we'll be collaborating on something else in the spring quarter. And I hope to teach that again here, because I really enjoyed being in the Segal Center as a place to hang out a sign and say, let's work in performance and technology for a minute. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Thanks for your attention. That's it.